faded in a way. As a student of the Bible, interested in the context of Israel, I realized how close the connection was between the lechet et Elohim, to walk in the ways of the Lord, or with the Lord, and halakha. Or is it? Is there a connection? How close is the connection between this extremely common biblical metaphor and this extremely common rabbinic Jewish term of Jewish practice or law? What is the meaning of halakha? Why isn't it halicha? Okay. Is everything okay? Okay. Are we online? Okay. Okay. So two different gerunds. Halicha tends to be more of a procession in the Bible. Halicha leiran means more walking. Halakha means more Jewish law. All these questions. What's the nascent origins or impetus for halakha? How were the ancient Jews and Jewish believers walking out their faith? So, this is, if you look at some famous theologians, they argue that this walking metaphor is the most common metaphor for the spiritual life in the Older Testament, in the Tanakh. So, Eugene, famous Old Testament theologian from Dallas, I think. Let's look briefly at just a couple examples from the Bible, from the Older Testament, the Hebrew Bible. I like referring to it as the Older Bible. Okay. Sure. Okay, starting over, just joking. So Genesis 5:22, a first example of the root halakh, to walk. And it's kind of prototypical. Enoch is so well-pleasing to God that he is taken up, it seems. It says twice he walked with God. And so this establishes sort of a prototypical example for the other patriarchs to follow after him. Abraham walks before God. Noah walks with God, right? And we can see, how this is translated in this first example. It's not translated with a motion verb. It's translated metaphorical right from the beginning. So, evresto, to please or be pleasing, is the way it's typically translated throughout Genesis. So there's no going, there's no poreuomai, there's no peripatein. It's automatically understood as a metaphorical relational aspect of how Enoch, Noah, Abraham are all well-pleasing. But that doesn't last for long. So Genesis starts off this way, but we see that basically from Exodus onwards, we get a little bit of that well-pleasing language in the Psalms, but it's rare, only occurs 14 times in the whole Tanakh, and some of them aren't even related to hitalech, so it's coming from other Hebrew verbs, right? But now we get to the typical expression that's found hundreds of times. The typical translation of halakh, of going, is the Greek word pορεύομαι, or porevestai. And so I want to emphasize that this is the default way of conveying halakh. This is the first religio-moral metaphorical use of pορεύομαι in the Septuagint. Exodus 16:4, the Lord said to Moses, "Look, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out, and they shall collect the day's portion for a day, so that I may test them whether they will follow," I note that, walk by, or go by my law or not. I want to emphasize this as this first example because it'll help us understand the New Testament in just a few minutes. The liminal state of, or the overlapping semantic range there of going and following, found in porevestai or poreuomai. So going, following, embedded there in its usage. An atypical example I wanted to bring out, it's extremely rare. It's like 6 times, I think, in the 314 examples, I think it's about 6 times, where you do have the verb peripatein used to translate halakh, walk or go in Greek. So this is atypical. This is the left column here, Leviticus 26:12. But I want to emphasize too that this is embedded in other examples in Leviticus 26, I think it's 7 times, where you have this going imagery used to talk about proximity. And here's just a beautiful example of how intimate it is. I will walk among you, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people. You can look at the Greek and Hebrew there to see how that's conveyed, but it's there. You can see. Peripatein, right, is used. So the double compound. Ben Sira offers a very nice example too, and I want to highlight this as well because we're going to lead up to the New Testament later about the overlapping status of going and following. Ben Sira or Sirach, it says, highlights the proximity with God. It's also in Hebrew, so it's interesting too. Quote in English, in order that all the sons of Israel might see that it is good to walk behind the Lord. And you have opiso coupled with previsai to convey that going after. We won't go into the Hebrew there. I bring Deuteronomy 11:22 as another example, going back to Exodus 16:4, kind of working through the Pentateuch, right? And Deuteronomy, then from here on, just going to emphasize that previsai is the main way to talk about going in his ways. So that previsai basically means go, and halakh, believe it or not, the Hebrew word halakh basically means go too, not walk. It has to have a constituent to help it out to clarify that it's walking. If you really want to convey walk in Hebrew, what do? Use the hitpel form, hitalech, right? So my first attempt at the PhD this time around, I titled my first PhD title was Going with God. But then it didn't sound so good, so I changed it. But I wanted to make the point that here we really have going with God. If you translate it extra literally, as the Septuagint nicely did in a very wooden fashion, but again with constituents, meaning like are there particles or prepositions, it can transform that. We'll talk about that, how it encodes motion or manner and lexicalization patterns in just a minute. So anyway, Deuteronomy 11:12, nice example that will serve us for the rest of the Tanakh, basically, except that there are some important features to show. 10 more minutes? Okay. Important features to show the embodied conceptual metaphor. We're going to have to move quickly. Genesis 48:15. Jacob is blessing Joseph. It says, the God before whom my ancestors Abraham and Isaac walked. So God is actually walking from behind. And this is beautiful because it talks about just not just walking, but also shepherding, right? Who's been my shepherd all these days. And so shepherding and wilderness images and lived experiences, not just images, but embodied experience are the basis for this conceptual metaphor. I want to note the important use of prepositions, and we'll have to skip that now, but just we can see lifnei, we can see achrei, and also we can note that shepherding often takes place from behind. You lead the sheep first, you find out which ones are the leaders, you get them going in the right direction, and you push from behind. So this is interesting. So God does lead from the front and as well as from behind. And we have many examples of God walking behind, which is, I'm trying to demonstrate that God is among us, is with us, Emmanuel, right? And we see that. I will not have time to get into this deep linguistic jargon that took me a semester just to kind of comprehend what lexicalization patterns and lexicalization, all of that entails. Basically, Hebrew and Greek and all languages encode motion or manner in different ways, and it can be encoded in the verb or the constituent. And hold on to that when we come in just a little bit. So as a review, so far we have, in looking forward to the New Testament now, in Jewish Greek, which I'm taking from basically the Septuagint onwards, we see that the walking metaphor is very common. First, through this metaphorical way, talking about everesto, but then much more common poreuomai, and just a teeny bit peripatein. Almost, it's negligent. I mean, it's negligible. Walking metaphor in Judaic Greek is very common. It's found throughout so many different bodies of literature in ancient Jewish Greek. For example, in Philo, an incredible passage which I cannot read now, but it says to follow God, then according to Moses, is just one verse, 131, migration 131. To follow God is to then, according to Moses, that most holy men, our aim and object, as he says elsewhere too, thou shalt go in the steps, follow in the Lord thy God. He is not speaking of movement by the use of our legs, for while earth carries man, I do not know whether even the whole universe carries God, but is evidently employing figurative language to bring out how the soul should comply with those divine ordinances, the guiding principles of which is the honoring of him to whom all things owe their being. A beautiful example of how Philo uses both poreuomai and sometimes peripatein, especially in peripatein, 47 times out of 51 times in Philo's. Okay, walking in the New Testament. Very rare is walking language used in the Synoptic Gospels. Very common is in the book of John. Why is this? It had me stumped for a while. Basically because we have follow me language. So follow me functions in that walking after. In John and later Pauline epistles, we get tons of walking language. Every example that Paul uses, we're going to have to skip Mark 7:5, which is so often, Mark 7:5 is so often misinterpreted by pastors and scholars because they don't know the purity context of Jewish context. I would encourage us to look at that to really understand Acts 21 as well, to understand what customs means, but we're not going to do that now. John uses this walking language, peripatein, I want to emphasize, and not poreuomai much. It does do both. But peripatein is the dominant word that's used in the New Testament rather than poreuomai. And that's significant because we would expect that the New Testament would be using the Septuagintal language, which is way dominantly poreuomai, but it's not. It's using peripatein. And so this is one of the big questions I tried to answer. Why the shift? Just a few examples of walking in the New Testament for Paul. Romans 6:4, should walk in newness of life. Romans 14:15, walking in love. Right. I then embarked on, because people said that maybe this comes from peripatetics, the Hellenistic philosophers, right? The short answer is it doesn't. The peripatos was a location, just like the Stoa. This is a chidush, a brand new thing that I don't think anybody's discovered, and I think can affect our understanding. So basically, so it doesn't come from the peripatetics, the Greek philosophers. Let's look at all the Greek literature prior to the 1st century AD to see if any examples of peripatein are used metaphorically, and the answer is 0. So there's not one example peripatein used from the 5th century BC through the 1st century AD, unless it's Judaic Greek, Jewish Greek. So in Jewish authors, we find that it's fairly common, not as much as we'd expect. And that is a little bit surprising. Let me just engage that briefly. So you don't find it at all in Josephus. He's writing to a Roman audience. In Philo, the first half of his corpus, he's writing to Jews and exegesis, and you find it a lot. When he gets on his political wagon and goes to Rome, and he's an ambassador for the second half of his life, guess what happens? He doesn't use almost at all walking language to convey the moral metaphor, which follows Maren Niehoff's recent book on Philo. I was shocked that what she proposed as a shift in focus follows exactly linguistically. So, and we say, wait a minute. And I gave you some examples. Paul's writing to Gentiles. His main audience is not Jews at all, or maybe not at all, completely not Jews. He is writing to Gentiles. So how is he using this walking metaphor so much to Gentiles? Josephus wasn't, but who was Paul going to over and over again? Where was he finding his Gentiles? Over and over and over again. It's like 1 or 2 examples where he doesn't go to a Jewish place. Synagogue. He's beaten up. He's cast out. He's going to go to another place, right? No, goes back to the synagogue, as was his custom. Where does he find the Gentiles? in the synagogue. They're going to the synagogue, according to Acts 15, all the time. Don't put too much on the Gentiles because they're going to be going back to the synagogue and hearing Moses preached every week. These Gentiles are what? Are hearing Jewish language. Hebrew maybe don't understand it, but it's translated. They get the metaphor because they're in a Jewish space week after week. And so that's how I understand this. A very side point that I think is barely worth mentioning, but one of my reviewers thought it was really important. It was in a footnote. And people often get tripped on this, again, pun intended. Paul walked a lot, but he never uses this walking language to convey physical walking. Paul was born Saul, right? And often we have scholars and preachers claiming that he changed his name. That's a lie, or that's not, we have no evidence for that. So if we look closely at the Greek lexicons and Greek lexical matters, we realize that Saulus, which is the Greek form of Saul, means an improper gait, as in a homosexual gait or a sensual walk. So when Paul is wanting to be understood in a wholesome sort of way, he wouldn't say, my name is sexual walk, right? And so he took on another name, or had a name, maybe because of his first convert, we don't know, but we can see this. Leary wrote it back in 1964. 1992, Paul's improper name. And so just a small note to realize that Paul's use of the moral metaphor is not related to his physical walking, and his name is adapted because of the strange kind of walk that Saulus would convey in a Greek-speaking environment. Okay. My PhD thesis was called Walking with God, Hebraic Metaphor and Halakha in Jewish Discourse in Greek during the Second Temple period. I found that as a summary the walking metaphor was very common in Judaic Greek. There's an absence of walking metaphor completely as far as peripatein and even poreuomai in the first century. I could only look at the first century for poreuomai. I couldn't go back because poreuomai is a very common word. And so I was only able to look at the first century AD. So there's an absence of walking metaphor completely in peripatein and also in poreuomai in the first century. And there's a huge prevalence in the Hebrew Bible and a huge tick usage in Qumran, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what does it mean to walk with God? I haven't been able to get into the linguistic evidence enough, but I've hinted at with lexical patterns, lexical encoding of where the manner rather than the motion is. And so as a summary, we see that halakh is a Hebrew concept that's imposed or borrowed into Greek in a Jewish context. It has to do with obedience and alignment. It also has to do with proximity to God or to his commandments. It's very interesting. I like the word commands rather than precepts a lot better because a commandment is related to a commander. So even if you're following commands, you're still in relationship to something that God has spoken. Prepositions matter. We have to walk, lechet et, be, im, all of these things that are conveyed in Greek, right? Walking with, walking before, walking after. God is proximate. He is near. And so also, last thing, there is progressive movement, but it's not destination oriented. It's a big deal, which I can't get into now, but the linguistics argue that in Hebrew and in the Greek, because of the peripatein, walking around, it's almost like you're going nowhere, right? It's about a manner of walking, and it's not about getting to a destination. So it's about the journey and not the destination, both in Hebrew and in Greek. We're gonna finish off. May we walk with the Lord. I want to save time for questions and answers, right? So may we walk with the Lord in his ways all of our days. Amen. Leviticus 6:16 has been kind of a new 10-year life verse. Stand by the ways and see and ask the ancient past where the good way is and walk in it, then you'll find rest for your souls. And that conveys kind of that proximity and nearness and spiritual life that this is. May your walk also include a journey to Jerusalem Seminary.
Thank you, Baruch Brian. It's wonderful to see you here. And thank you for the presentation. And just have comments and some questions. One is that you're finding from your PhD thesis, wonderful. That is the work terminology or verb is not metaphorically used in Hellenic Greek. Wonderful, amazing. But this is, in our case, in the Greek New Testament, and also Septuagint is a metaphorical, isn't it? And then later on, you said that the original local Greeks speaking people came to understand this metaphorical usage of halakha, right? You said so.
Yeah.
If I remember.
Yes, I would.
And
I would say halicha rather than halakha. I don't have time to get it, but just that little difference.
A bit different thing. Work in English, working metaphor. And then it's very interesting that this is almost like redeeming the term into our side. The original, the Greek word poreuomai, this is not metaphorical, but it's later on it became metaphorical.
Yes, so it is metaphorical in the Septuagint.
Yes, it is.
It's not used, as far as I can see, in Hellenic Greek. They had different ways of conveying. They did use odos, way, in metaphorical way, and they did talk about going on waterways, but that was traveling not by foot, but by ship. Yeah. And a more common, even in a Greek context, is if you want to convey moral metaphors, you would talk to the physician of your soul. So if you're healthy, you are morally upright in Greek context.
One way I thought this is kind of converting secular terms into our use in our Bible is possible. And then another one is like converting or redeeming terms. Another one is a bit of a technical, probably is, have you happened to find out the difference between the use between the binyanim or by Hebrew verbs? Like in Genesis, they're working with the God who used the hit file form often, but in Deuteronomy is the kal form was used. Have you seen the difference between the binyanim?
Yes. So in the kal form, you are required, or Hebrew grammar requires you to put a preposition there. So you can't just have halakh understood metaphorically, because then you're physically going somewhere. But if you have halakh baderech, then that opens up the possibility that you're walking on a path, and that opens up the ideas. Also, halakh b'mitzvotav, like if you walk in the commandments. Well, I mean, you can't walk honor in the commandments, right? So this is metaphorical. So by adding these different aspects, you can move it from a straightforward literal sense to a metaphorical sense. And so that's done very commonly. Surprisingly, the hit-telech form, the hit-kal form, is not used much outside of it's predominantly used in Genesis to convey the metaphor, and not, you see it in Kings and some of the Jeremiah, but it's very rare. So yes, the kal can convey the metaphor, but it requires other constituents to help that move from motion to manner.
Thank you, Baruch. Actually, your study is a Second Temple literature, but I have a question from in First Kings. When David was about to die, he was talking to his son Solomon, and he was saying, "Anochi halakh bederech kol haaretz." So halakh bederech is there. Have you included something from those parts?
So there are other metaphorical ways of talking about the verb halakh. One is to die, right? Or so like that. Yeah. So I specified in my work, it's not just metaphorical, but it's the moral religio metaphor. So there are other metaphors that are not as common, but so I was only focusing, I mean, I did look at that because I had to, but so we had to do metaphorical examples, but they're not as common as the moral religious metaphor that's conveyed in halakh, bederech, or poreuomai, which is an extra wooden translation, or eventually peripatein. Is that, yeah, that answers the question.
Thank you for your presentation. So you pointed out that after Genesis, the predominant Septuagint translation for halakh is poreuomai, whereas the New Testament writers, and I guess various writers, prefer peripatein.
Yep.
What occasioned this change? Is it a fresh and enhanced understanding of the Hebrew that went beyond how the Septuagint saw it? Did you see any concrete point of contacts where they may have got this?
This is part that I skipped over. Thank you very much for allowing. So yes, Hebrew was a living language in the 1st century AD. It's going to take a long time for New Testament scholars to believe it, but linguists in Israel already know it. So that, I believe, let's give a concrete example. Paul wasn't past tense a Pharisee, he was a present tense Pharisee until the day he dies. He says he's done nothing against the customs of the Jews. In the 2nd century BC, we have a rise in walking imagery beginning in the Dead Sea Scrolls and a rise in a certain movement called the Pharisees. Pharisees emphasize what? How you walk as whether you're a Jew or not. So it wasn't just how, there's 3 major strands, at least, of Jewish identity. What are they? Who your mama is, or who your dad is. For the Older Testament, it's the dad. New Testament onwards, it's the mother. So it's your genealogy, number 1. 2, are you from Judea, right? The word for Judea and Jew is the exact same in Greek, right? So those are your 2 primary senses. What happens in the 2nd century when you have movement, diaspora coming back? It's even after Babylon, right? So it starts in the Persian period. What happens? It's about how you practice, how you walk. And so this is it's been called a revolution of halakha, halakhic revolution, or a turn. John Collins calls it a turn, a revolution in the emphasis upon practice, or halakha, as far as identity. And so this language is picked up, and they're not translating. It's a different genre too, right? The Septuagint is a translated work. They're living life, and they're picking up the Hebraic mindset, or Hebrew speaking, right? And they're importing that into their writings. Probably there's taught speech, right? We don't have speech from the 1st century recorded, right? But we do have texts, and they are conveying this lived environment where Hebrew was still active, and there's a rise in practice, which brings about this rise in usage of walking language and circumvents the Septuagint. Does that make sense? It goes kind of from the Hebrew substructure, not through the translation, and goes right to the immediate needs of Jewish identity and how you live your life. I hope that answered it. See you next year in Jerusalem. Seminary.